On the morning of March 11, 1985, a man named Viktor Sokolov stepped off an Aeroflot flight at Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow, carrying nothing but a worn leather briefcase and 16 years of silence. His face had aged in ways that had nothing to do with time. The immigration officer glanced at his passport, stamped it without a word, and waved him through. No one welcomed him home. No one was supposed to know he had ever left. He walked through the terminal like a ghost passing through walls, his eyes scanning the crowd with the trained instinct of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades watching for threats that never announced themselves. The air smelled of diesel and wet wool. Outside, snow fell in thick. Silent curtains over the city he had not seen since 1969. Moscow looked different, taller, grayer, more tired. Viktor was 43 years old, but his hands shook like those of a man twice that age. He lit a cigarette outside the terminal and watched the smoke disappear into the March cold. Somewhere behind him, in the shadows of the arrival hall, 2 men in dark coats watched him smoke. They would follow him for the next 6 months. He knew this. He had written the protocols himself. What Viktor Sokolov did not know, what no one in the directorate had thought to tell him, was that his younger brother, Alexei, the boy he had left behind in 1969 with promises of letters and visits that never came, was no longer in Moscow. Alexei had emigrated to the United States in 1979 under a Jewish refugee visa. He had changed his name to Alex Sullivan. And for the past 3 years, he had been working as a signals intelligence analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency at Langley, Virginia. The brothers had not spoken in 16 years. They would meet again in 7 months. And when they did, one of them would have to decide whether blood was thicker than allegiance, or whether allegiance had become the only family that mattered anymore. The Cold War was not a war of battlefields. It was a war of information, paranoia, and the slow corrosion of trust. By 1985, the world had lived under the shadow of mutual assured destruction for nearly 4 decades. The United States and the Soviet Union had built enough nuclear weapons to end human civilization several times over, and both sides had come terrifyingly close to using them. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had brought the world to the edge of annihilation. The Able Archer exercises of 1983 had nearly triggered a Soviet nuclear launch based on the belief that NATO was preparing a first strike, but the real war was fought in silence. In the basement offices of KGB headquarters at Lubyanka Square, in the 7th floor conference rooms of CIA headquarters in Langley, in the embassies, consulates, and safe houses scattered across every capital city on Earth. It was fought by men and women whose names would never appear in history books, whose faces would never be photographed, whose deaths would be attributed to accidents, suicides, or natural causes. Espionage had become the dominant language of international relations. Every diplomat was assumed to be a spy. Every scientist traveling abroad was debriefed upon return. Every defector was suspected of being a double agent. Trust was a liability. Loyalty was measured not by what you said, but by what you were willing to sacrifice. The KGB, the Committee for State Security, was the Soviet Union's primary instrument of control, both at home and abroad. With over 500,000 employees and informants, it monitored every aspect of Soviet life. It read letters, tapped phones, infiltrated dissident groups, and maintained files on millions of citizens. Abroad, it ran one of the most extensive intelligence networks in history, with agents embedded in governments, universities, corporations, and media organizations across the West. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, operated with a different mandate but similar methods. It recruited sources inside the Soviet government, ran covert operations to destabilize pro-Soviet regimes, and worked tirelessly to penetrate the Iron Curtain. Its Moscow station was one of the most dangerous postings in the world. KGB surveillance was so thorough that American diplomats assumed every conversation was recorded, every movement tracked, every contact reported. Between these two leviathans, ordinary people lived and died. Some were ideologues, true believers in communism or capitalism, willing to betray their countries for a vision of a better world. Some were mercenaries, selling secrets for money or security. Some were blackmailed, coerced, or threatened into cooperation. And some were simply caught in the machinery, ground down by forces they could neither understand nor escape. Viktor Sokolov had been all of these things at different times. He had believed, and then stopped believing. He had been loyal, and then learned that loyalty was a currency that could be spent but never repaid. He had seen men destroyed for asking questions, and others rewarded for knowing when to stay silent. Now he was home, and home was the most dangerous place he could be. Viktor's apartment was in a gray block on Leninsky Prospect, assigned to him by the directorate upon his return. It was small, 2 rooms, a narrow kitchen, a bathroom with pipes that rattled and groaned through the night. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbors arguing, coughing, making love. The furniture was standard issue, a bed with a metal frame, a table with 2 chairs, a lamp that flickered when the voltage dropped. He unpacked his briefcase on the first night. Inside were 3 changes of clothes, a shaving kit, a Russian-English dictionary that he no longer needed, and a single photograph. The photograph showed 2 boys standing in front of a wooden dacha, summer sunlight filtering through birch trees behind them. The older boy had his arm around the younger one's shoulders. Both were smiling. Viktor placed the photograph face down in a drawer and did not look at it again for 3 weeks. His days fell into a rhythm that was both familiar and alien. Every morning at 7, he walked to the Lubyanka for debriefing sessions that lasted anywhere from 2 to 6 hours. He sat across from officers he had once trained, men who were now tasked with verifying every detail of his 16 years abroad. They asked him about operations, contacts, dead drops, cipher systems, surveillance techniques. They asked him the same questions in different orders, looking for inconsistencies, contradictions, signs of compromise. The questions were professional, almost polite. But underneath the politeness was the unspoken reality. Viktor had spent 16 years in the West. He had lived in cities where people could speak freely, travel without permission, read forbidden books. He had breathed the air of the enemy. And now he had to prove that the air had not changed him. He answered every question with the precision of a man who had rehearsed his testimony for months. He provided names, dates, operational details. He admitted to successes and failures. He volunteered information that they already knew, and withheld information that they would never ask about. But there was one question they never asked, because they did not know it existed. What would you do if you discovered that someone you loved had become the enemy? Viktor's legend, the false identity he had lived under for 16 years, was that of a Swedish businessman named Lars Eriksson. He had been inserted into Stockholm in 1969 as part of a long-term penetration operation targeting NATO communications infrastructure. His cover was perfect. A small import-export company that provided just enough legitimate business to justify travel across Western Europe. He spoke fluent Swedish, German, and English. He paid his taxes, attended local cultural events, and maintained a reputation as a quiet, reliable businessman with no interest in politics. For the first 5 years, his work had been patient and methodical. He cultivated relationships with engineers, technicians, and government contractors who had access to sensitive information. He never asked direct questions. He never pushed too hard. He simply listened, remembered, and reported back to Moscow through a series of dead drops and encrypted messages sent via shortwave radio. His greatest success came in 1976 when he recruited a signals technician working on a classified NATO communications upgrade. The technician, a man named Hans Richter, was deeply in debt and desperate. Viktor offered him money, not ideology. Over the next 3 years, Richter provided technical specifications that allowed Soviet engineers to develop countermeasures against NATO's encrypted communication systems. The intelligence was considered so valuable that Viktor received a commendation, delivered, of course, in secret. But success came with a price. The more valuable he became, the longer he was required to stay in place. Years turned into a decade. The temporary assignment became permanent. The letters he wrote to his family in Moscow went unanswered because the KGB decided that maintaining his cover required complete isolation. He was told that his mother had been informed of his diplomatic posting and that she understood. He was not told that she had died in 1974, or that his younger brother, Alexei, had been denied permission to attend her funeral because of Victor's classified status. In 1983, Hans Richter was arrested by West German counterintelligence. Victor was never directly implicated, but the network began to unravel. Moscow ordered him to go dormant, cease all contact, and wait for extraction. He spent 18 months in a state of enforced inactivity, living in his Stockholm apartment, going through the motions of running his business and watching the walls close in. The extraction, when it finally came, was swift and anticlimactic. A coded message on a shortwave frequency. A train to Copenhagen. A Soviet freighter waiting in the harbor. And then the long journey home, through the Baltic Sea, past the Gulf of Finland, into the cold gray waters of the Soviet Empire. He had left Moscow as a young man with ideals and ambitions. He returned as a middle-aged operative with nothing but questions he was not allowed to ask. The city felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The streets were the same, but the people moved differently. Slower, more cautious, with eyes that avoided contact. The stores had less than he remembered. The lines were longer. The propaganda was louder and more desperate, as if the system itself sensed that time was running out. Victor walked through Gorky Park on a Sunday afternoon in late March, watching families ice skate on the frozen ponds. Children laughed and fell and got back up. Parents stood at the edges, calling out warnings and encouragement. It looked like happiness, or at least the performance of happiness, and Victor wondered if he had ever felt that way himself. He had always believed in the system, not blindly, but earnestly. He had believed that the Soviet Union, despite its flaws, represented humanity's best hope for a just and equal society. He had believed that the West, for all its wealth and freedom, was fundamentally corrupt, a civilization built on exploitation and deception. He had believed that his work, his sacrifices, served a higher purpose. But 16 years in the West had complicated his beliefs. He had seen poverty in Stockholm, yes, but he had also seen prosperity that was not reserved for the party elite. He had seen people criticize their governments without fear of arrest. He had seen bookstores filled with ideas that contradicted each other, and no one was punished for reading them. He had also seen the other side of the West, the homelessness, the racism, the vast inequalities. He had seen how money could buy justice, how corporations wielded more power than citizens, how the promise of freedom was often just another form of control. Neither side had a monopoly on truth or virtue. Both were empires built on lies and sustained by fear. And Victor had spent 16 years serving one of them, only to return and realize that he no longer knew what he believed, or whether belief itself mattered anymore. He sat on a bench near the pond and watched the skaters until the sun began to set. As he stood to leave, he noticed a man in a dark coat standing near the park entrance, smoking a cigarette and watching him. Victor recognized the surveillance technique, not obvious enough to intimidate, but visible enough to remind him that he was never alone. He walked home through the twilight, past apartment blocks that all looked the same, and wondered if his brother had ever thought about him during the years of silence. He wondered if Alexei remembered the summers at the dacha, the promises they had made as children, the world they had believed would always be theirs. He did not know that Alexei thought about him every day. He did not know that Alexei had tried to find him, had written letters that were intercepted, had asked questions that went unanswered. He did not know that Alexei had left the Soviet Union not out of ideology, but out of desperation, because staying meant living under the shadow of a brother who had disappeared, into the machinery of the state, and no one would tell him why. And he did not know that in 7 months the machinery of the Cold War would bring them face to face in a hotel room in Vienna, and force them both to choose between the truths they had learned and the lies they had lived. The debriefings continued through April and into May. Victor's interrogators were thorough, but not cruel. They understood that he had served with distinction, that his operational security had been exemplary, that his intelligence had been valuable. But they also understood that anyone who had spent that long in the West was a potential security risk. The mind could be compromised in subtle ways. Loyalties could shift without conscious awareness. A man could return home and still be carrying the enemy inside him. One afternoon in mid-May, Victor was introduced to a new interrogator, a younger officer named Konstantin Petrov, who arrived with a file folder and a tape recorder. Petrov had the kind of face that revealed nothing, the kind of voice that asked questions as if they were casual observations. "You lived as Lars Eriksson for 16 years, Petrov said, setting the tape recorder on the table between them. "That's a long time to maintain a false identity. Did you ever forget who you really were?" Victor lit a cigarette and considered the question. "No," he said. "But I became very good at pretending." "Pretending to be Lars or pretending to be Victor?" Victor smiled slightly. "Both." Petrov made a note in his file. "You had no contact with your family during this period. No letters, no phone calls, no visits. That must have been difficult. It was necessary. Did you ever think about them? Your mother? Your brother? Of course. What did you think?" Victor exhaled smoke and watched it curl toward the ceiling. "I thought they understood why I couldn't be there. I thought they knew I was serving the motherland." Petrov nodded slowly. "Your mother passed away in 1974. Were you informed?" Victor's expression did not change, but something tightened in his chest. "No, your brother Alexei immigrated to the United States in 1979. Were you informed of this?" The tightness became a cold, spreading numbness. Victor stared at Petrov for a long moment, trying to process the words. "No," he said quietly. "I was not informed." Petrov closed the file. "We thought it was best that you complete your mission without distraction. Personal attachments can compromise operational effectiveness." Victor crushed his cigarette in the ashtray between them. His hand was steady, but his mind was spinning. Alexei in America. His brother, the boy he had left behind, living in the heart of the enemy. It didn't seem possible. Alexei had been a believer, a member of the Komsomol, a loyal son of the Soviet Union. What had happened? Why had he left? "Is there anything else you need to tell me?" Petrov asked. Victor met his eyes. "No." Petrov turned off the tape recorder and stood. "Good. We'll continue tomorrow." After Petrov left, Victor sat alone in the interrogation room for 20 minutes, staring at the wall. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Somewhere in the building, someone was typing on a manual typewriter, the keys striking with mechanical precision. He thought about Alexei as a child, always following him, always asking questions, always believing that Victor had the answers. He thought about the last time they had seen each other, in the summer of 1969. Just before Victor's diplomatic assignment was announced. They had gone to the dacha one final time, and Alexei had asked when Victor would come back. "Soon," Victor had said. "I promise." It was the first lie he had ever told his brother. It would not be the last. Victor requested access to immigration records, citing personal reasons. His request was denied. He requested permission to write a letter to his brother. His request was denied. He requested information about why Alexei had been allowed to emigrate when family members of intelligence officers were typically monitored for life. His request was not denied. It was simply ignored, as if he had never asked. The message was clear. Alexei was no longer his concern. Victor's personal life, his family, his past, all of it had been absorbed into the operational needs of the state. He was a tool, and tools did not have brothers. Tools did not have regrets, but tools could remember. And in the quiet of his apartment, late at night when the surveillance teams changed shifts and the building fell silent, Victor allowed himself to remember. He remembered Alexei learning to read, sounding out words from old newspapers, while Victor corrected his pronunciation. He remembered teaching Alexei to swim in the lake near the dacha, holding him up until he found the courage to let go. He remembered their father, a factory foreman who had died when Victor was 15 and Alexei was 8. And how Victor had promised to take care of his younger brother, to be the man their father had been. He had broken that promise. He had chosen the state over family, duty over love, and told himself it was noble. Now his mother was dead, his brother was gone, and he was sitting alone in a cold apartment, wondering what any of it had been for. In late June, Victor was reassigned to a training position at the Red Banner Institute, the KGB's Advanced Intelligence School. He would teach tradecraft to new operatives: surveillance, counter-surveillance, cover maintenance, operational security. It was a quiet posting, a reward for service and a way to keep him occupied while the directorate decided whether he could be trusted for active operations again. He accepted the position without complaint. He was good at teaching. He understood the psychology of deception, the discipline required to live a lie for years without breaking. He could pass on the techniques that had kept him alive and undetected for 16 years. But he could not teach the one lesson that mattered most: that loyalty to the system would never be reciprocated. That the state would take everything you had to give and then take more. That when your usefulness ended, you would be discarded like every other tool that had outlived its purpose. On July 4th, a date he noted with bitter irony, Victor received an envelope delivered by courier to his apartment. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address in Vienna and a date: October 12, 1985. There were no other instructions, no explanation. But Victor understood. He had written enough operational orders to recognize one when he received it. Someone wanted him in Vienna. Someone with the authority to summon him across borders and through the bureaucracy of the KGB. And Victor had a terrible, growing certainty that he knew why. Summer in Moscow was brief and beautiful and melancholy, like everything in Russia. Victor spent his weekends walking through the city, relearning the geography of his youth. He visited the university where he had studied history and languages. He stood outside the apartment building where he had grown up, looking up at the window of what had been his family's flat, now occupied by strangers. He taught his classes at the Red Banner Institute with quiet competence. His students respected him. They called him comrade instructor and listened carefully when he spoke about the loneliness of deep cover. The discipline required to maintain a false life, the importance of never letting emotion compromise the mission. One afternoon, a young officer asked him a question that cut through the professional facade. "Comrade instructor, how did you stay loyal for so long? How did you remember who you were?" Victor considered the question for a long time. The other students waited, notebooks open, pens ready. Outside the window, summer rain fell on the Lubyanka courtyard. "You don't stay loyal by remembering who you are," Victor said finally. "You stay loyal by forgetting. You become the lie so completely that the truth becomes the fiction. And when it's over, when you come home, you realize that you've forgotten how to be anything else." The students wrote this down as if it were wisdom. Victor wondered if any of them understood what he was really saying. As October approached, Victor prepared for Vienna. He requisitioned a new passport under his Lars Eriksson identity. He studied current intelligence reports on Western surveillance capabilities in Austria. He reviewed the protocols for emergency contact and extraction. He did everything a professional operative should do. But late at night, alone in his apartment, he allowed himself to imagine a scenario that had nothing to do with duty or orders. He imagined walking into a cafe in Vienna and seeing his brother across the room. He imagined Alexei's face, older now, marked by experiences Victor knew nothing about, but still recognizably his brother. He imagined what they would say to each other after 16 years of silence. And he imagined the moment when they would both realize that they were no longer family, that they had become representatives of opposing systems, carrying secrets that could destroy each other. That blood meant nothing compared to the weight of classified information and the machinery of intelligence services that would never let them simply walk away. On October 10, 1985, Viktor Sokolov boarded an Aeroflot flight to Vienna, carrying his Lars Eriksson passport and a briefcase containing documents he had not been allowed to read. He sat in the window seat and watched Moscow disappear beneath the clouds and wondered if he would ever come home again. 2 days later, on October 12th, Alex Sullivan, formerly Alexei Sokolov, would board a commercial flight from Washington Dulles to Vienna, authorized by the CIA for a sensitive intelligence meeting. He would arrive at the same hotel where Victor was staying. He would enter the same conference room, and the two brothers would see each other for the first time in 16 years. Across a table covered with classified documents, with handlers from both sides watching to ensure that neither one betrayed their respective governments. The Cold War had many casualties. Most of them died without ever appearing in the statistics. They died of loneliness, doubt, betrayal, and the slow erosion of everything they had once believed in. They died in interrogation rooms and hotel rooms in quiet apartments where no one would find them for days. Victor and Alexei Sokolov would not die in Vienna, but something else would end there. And neither brother knew as they traveled toward their reunion whether what they were about to lose mattered more than what they had already sacrificed. The machinery of history ground on, indifferent to personal tragedy. The Cold War cared nothing for brothers or promises or the summers they had spent at a dacha that no longer existed. It demanded loyalty without reciprocation, sacrifice without meaning, and silence about the cost. And it always, always collected its debts. Vienna in October was a city caught between empires, a neutral stage where the actors of the Cold War performed their rituals of deception and exchange. The Danube flowed gray and cold through the heart of the city, dividing nothing and connecting everything. The grand imperial architecture of the Habsburgs stood as a reminder that empires rose and fell. But the business of power continued regardless of which flag flew over the palace. Victor arrived at the Hotel Sacher on the evening of October 11th. His room overlooked the opera house, and from his window he could see the elaborate facade lit against the autumn darkness. The hotel was a favorite of intelligence services from both sides, expensive enough to provide discretion, public enough to offer plausible deniability. Its chandeliers and red velvet curtains created an atmosphere of old-world elegance that masked the modern. Transactions occurring in its private dining rooms and suites. He unpacked his single suitcase with the methodical precision of a man who had lived out of luggage for years. He hung his suit in the closet, placed his toiletries in the bathroom, and set his briefcase on the desk by the window. Then he sat in the armchair and waited, as he had waited in countless other hotel rooms across Europe, for instructions that would arrive in ways designed to seem coincidental. At 9:47 p.m., the phone rang. Herr Eriksson, a voice said in German. Your appointment tomorrow is confirmed for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Conference room 3. Someone will meet you in the lobby at 1:45. The line went dead before Victor could respond. He replaced the receiver and lit a cigarette, his third of the evening. His hands were steady, but his pulse was not. He had run operations across Western Europe. He had recruited sources, managed agents, and survived 16 years in hostile territory. But this meeting carried a weight that had nothing to do with professional competence. Somewhere in this city, perhaps in this very hotel, his brother was preparing for the same appointment. And neither of them knew what would happen when they saw each other again. Alex Sullivan arrived in Vienna on the morning of October 12th on a direct flight from Washington. He traveled under his real name, or rather, under the name that had become real over the past 6 years. Alexei Sokolov had ceased to exist in any official capacity when he crossed into Austria in 1979 with a one-way exit visa and a transit permit that led eventually to the United States. His emigration had not been easy. His brother's classified status had flagged his application immediately, and for months he had been interrogated by KGB officers who wanted to understand why the younger brother of a decorated intelligence officer would want to leave the motherland. They had threatened him, offered him incentives to withdraw his application, and finally, for reasons Alexei would never fully understand, approved his departure with the notation that he was to have no further contact with Soviet citizens abroad. He had arrived in New York in the winter of 1980, speaking passable English and carrying $200 in cash. The Jewish emigration networks had helped him find housing and work. Within a year, he had enrolled in night classes at City College, studying electrical engineering and computer science. He was brilliant with languages and systems. And by 1982, he had caught the attention of a CIA recruiter who recognized the value of a Soviet émigré with technical skills and first-hand knowledge of Soviet culture. The recruitment process had been slow and careful. The agency needed to be certain he was not a plant, not a sleeper agent sent to penetrate American intelligence. They had run background checks, administered polygraph tests, conducted psychological evaluations. They had asked him about his family, his beliefs, his reasons for leaving. And Alex had told them the truth, that he had left because staying meant living in the shadow of a system that consumed people, that his brother had disappeared into that system, and that he wanted a life where his worth was not determined by his proximity to power. They had believed him, eventually. And in 1983 he had joined the CIA as a junior analyst in the Directorate of Science and Technology, working on signals, intelligence, and Soviet communication systems. He was good at his work, meticulous, analytical, capable of seeing patterns that others missed. He had risen quickly, earned the respect of his colleagues, and become what he had never been allowed to be in Moscow, simply himself. Judged on merit rather than political reliability. But he had never stopped thinking about Victor. He had filed inquiries through immigration channels, asking if his brother could be located, if messages could be forwarded. The inquiries had gone nowhere. Viktor Sokolov did not exist in any accessible database. He had been erased or reclassified, or buried so deep in the intelligence apparatus that even the most persistent searches yielded nothing. And now, 6 years after leaving Moscow, Alex was in Vienna for a meeting that his section chief had described as highly sensitive and need to know. He had been told only that he would be debriefing a Soviet source who had provided information on KGB operations in Western Europe. He had been told to bring his expertise on Soviet communications protocols. He had been told that the agency had high confidence in the source's bona fides. He had not been told that the source was his brother. At 1:45 p.m., Victor stood in the lobby of the Hotel Sacher, wearing the gray suit he had brought from Moscow and the Lars Eriksson identity he wore like a second skin. A man in his 50s approached him, speaking German with a Russian accent barely concealed beneath the formal courtesy. "Herr Eriksson, please follow me." They walked down a corridor paneled in dark wood, past oil paintings of hunting scenes and aristocratic portraits. The man stopped at a door marked Conference Room 3 and knocked twice. A voice from inside said something Victor could not hear. The man opened the door and gestured for Victor to enter. The room was small and windowless, lit by a single chandelier that cast warm light over a mahogany table. 3 people were already seated. 2 of them Victor recognized from briefing photographs: Robert Keller, CIA station chief in Vienna, and Dr. Margaret Hayes, a senior analyst from Langley. The 3rd person had his back to the door, reading through a file folder. Victor stepped inside, and the 3rd person looked up. Time collapsed. 16 years vanished in the space of a heartbeat. Alexei, older now, wearing an American suit and American shoes, his hair cut in an American style, stared at Victor with an expression that moved through shock, disbelief, and something that looked like grief in the span of 3 seconds. "Victor," Alexei said in Russian, his voice barely above a whisper. Victor said nothing. He could not. Every word he had prepared, every operational protocol he had reviewed, every emotional barrier he had constructed, all of it disappeared, leaving only the terrible reality of seeing his brother across a table in a hotel room in Vienna, with handlers from opposing intelligence services watching to see what would happen next. Robert Keller cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, shall we begin?" The meeting that followed was professional and controlled. A carefully choreographed exchange of information governed by protocols that both sides understood. Victor, identified to the Americans only as Source Compass, provided details of KGB operations in Sweden and West Germany during the late 1970s and early 1980s. He confirmed information the CIA had received from other sources. He offered corrections to their assessments of Soviet capabilities. He answered questions with the precision of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. Alex sat across from him, taking notes, asking technical questions about communication systems and surveillance techniques. His voice was steady, his manner professional. To anyone watching, they were simply intelligence professionals doing their jobs. But beneath the surface, a different conversation was happening. In the pauses between questions, in the moments when their eyes met across the table, in the careful way they avoided saying each other's names, as if speaking them aloud would shatter the fragile professional distance they were both struggling to maintain. The debriefing lasted 2 hours. At the end, Keller closed his notebook and said, "Thank you, Source Compass. This has been valuable. We'll schedule a follow-up session for tomorrow afternoon." Dr. Hayes gathered her files and left. Keller stood, shook Victor's hand with the kind of studied neutrality that suggested he knew exactly what was happening and had decided not to acknowledge it. "Mr. Sullivan will show you out," he said, and followed Dr. Hayes into the corridor. The door closed. Victor and Alex were alone in the conference room, with silence spreading between them like a wound that had never properly healed. "You work for them," Victor said finally, in Russian. "Yes," Alex replied. "And you work for them." "I came home to what? To a system that erased you? That told me you were dead? That wouldn't even let me attend our mother's funeral because of your classified status?" Victor felt something crack inside him, a foundation he had not realized was already damaged. "They told me she died. They told me last month. They didn't tell me you had left." Alex laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course they didn't. You were more valuable if you believed you still had family waiting for you. It kept you loyal. I was always loyal. To what? To the people who lied to you? To the system that took 16 years of your life and gave you nothing back?" Victor stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I served the motherland. I believed in something larger than myself." You sacrificed everything," Alex interrupted, "including your family, including me." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and undeniable. Victor sat back down slowly, the fight draining out of him. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said quietly. "So did I," Alex said. When I took a new name and tried to build a life where I wasn't defined by who my brother was or what he had done. And now here we are, on opposite sides of a table, working for enemies, and I don't even know if we're still brothers or just two strangers who used to be family." Victor looked at his brother, really looked at him for the first time since entering the room. He saw the ways Alex had changed, the confidence in his posture, the directness of his gaze, the absence of the fear that had marked every Soviet citizen Victor had known. He saw someone who had escaped, who had chosen freedom over security, and who seemed neither ashamed nor apologetic about that choice. "Do you hate me?" Victor asked. Alex was silent for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "But I don't know if I can forgive you either. You chose them over us, over me. And that choice has defined everything since. I was following orders. I was serving. You were serving a lie," Alex said. "And you knew it. Maybe not at first, but eventually you knew. And you stayed anyway because it was easier than admitting that everything you believed in was built on sand." Victor wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but he could not, because Alex was right. He had known, somewhere deep in the part of himself that he had learned to ignore, that the system was corrupt, that loyalty was a one-way transaction, that the ideals he had sworn to protect were just propaganda covering the machinery of power. He had known, and he had stayed anyway. Because leaving would have meant admitting that he had wasted his life, that his sacrifices had been meaningless, that he had betrayed his family for nothing. "What happens now?" Victor asked. "You go back to your handlers, I go back to mine. We write our reports. We classify this meeting and never speak of it again." "And us?" Alex closed his file folder and stood. "There is no us, Victor. There's just two men who used to be brothers, before the world got between them." He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "I'm glad you're alive. I spent 6 years thinking you were dead. Knowing you're not is something. It's not enough, but it's something." Then he opened the door and left, and Victor sat alone in the conference room, staring at the chair where his brother had been, and understanding for the first time what he had truly lost. The follow-up meeting the next day was cancelled. Victor received a message at his hotel: new orders, immediate extraction, return to Moscow via Budapest. He was on a train by evening, watching Vienna disappear into the Austrian countryside and then into the past. The debriefing in Moscow was thorough and unforgiving. Victor's handlers wanted to know everything about the meeting: what questions the Americans had asked, what information they seemed most interested in, any signs that his cover had been compromised. They asked about the CIA personnel he had met. They showed him photographs. They asked him to identify each person by name and function. When they showed him Alex's photograph, Victor identified him as Mr. Sullivan, junior analyst, signals intelligence, approximately 30 years old. Any indication of his background? They asked. American accent, but possibly first-generation immigrant. Technical expertise suggests university education, likely in electrical engineering or computer science. No distinguishing mannerisms. They accepted his assessment and moved on to other questions. If they knew that Mr. Sullivan was actually Alexei Sokolov, if they knew that Victor had just debriefed his own brother without revealing their relationship, they gave no sign. And Victor did not volunteer the information. Because to volunteer, it would be to admit an emotional attachment. And emotional attachments were liabilities. He returned to his teaching position at the Red Banner Institute. He taught his classes, wrote his reports, and lived his quiet, monitored life in Moscow. He did not request permission to contact his brother. He did not file inquiries about immigration possibilities. He simply continued, day after day, doing what he had been trained to do, surviving by becoming invisible. In Langley, Virginia, Alex Sullivan submitted his debriefing report on Source Compass. He noted that the source appeared reliable, that his information corroborated existing intelligence, and that follow-up meetings would be valuable. He made no mention of the fact that Source Compass was his brother. He made no mention of their conversation after the others had left. He continued his work, analyzing Soviet communications intercepts, writing assessments, and attending meetings where men in suits discussed scenarios of nuclear war as if they were chess problems. He was good at his job. He was reliable. He was exactly what the agency needed. But at night, alone in his apartment in Arlington, he allowed himself to think about Victor, about the man his brother had become, about the weight of betrayal that neither of them had chosen but both had learned to carry. He thought about the dacha, the summers, the promises. He thought about the last time they had been together, before Victor had disappeared into the machinery of the KGB. He thought about the 16 years of silence and whether anything meaningful could survive that kind of absence. And he thought about the moment in Vienna when Victor had asked, "Do you hate me?" And Alex had said no, which was true. But he had not said the other truth, that he loved his brother still, despite everything, and that this love was the most painful thing he carried. The Cold War continued. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, bringing with him policies of glasnost and perestroika that would eventually unravel the Soviet system from within. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And the world that had defined Victor and Alex's lives, the world of competing empires and absolute loyalties and secrets that could never be spoken, came to an end. Victor retired from the KGB in 1992, when the KGB itself was dissolved and reformed into new agencies with new names, but the same essential functions. He received a small pension and was allowed to keep his apartment on Leninsky Prospect. He spent his days reading, walking, and trying to understand what his life had meant now that the system he had served no longer existed. He never saw his brother again. He learned, through channels that were never quite official, that Alex Sullivan had left the CIA in 1994 and taken a position with a private technology firm in Silicon Valley, that he had married an American woman, that he had children who would never know their uncle, who would grow up thinking of Russia as a foreign country rather than a homeland. Victor wrote letters that he never sent. He composed explanations, apologies, justifications, all of them inadequate, all of them failing to capture the complexity of what had happened. In the end, he kept the letters in a drawer with a photograph of two boys standing in front of a dacha. Summer sunlight filtering through birch trees behind them. Sometimes he took out the photograph and studied it, trying to remember what it felt like to be that boy with his arm around his brother's shoulders. Both of them smiling, both of them believing that the future would be kind. On a winter evening in 2003, Viktor Sokolov died of a heart attack in his apartment on Leninsky Prospect. He was 61 years old. He died alone, as most spies do, with no one to mourn him except the neighbors who had never quite known what he had done for a living. His body was discovered 3 days later. His apartment was searched, his belongings catalogued and distributed according to standard protocols. The photograph of two boys was filed with his personal effects and eventually incinerated, because there was no next of kin to claim it. A brief obituary appeared in a veteran's newsletter, noting that Viktor Alexandrovich Sokolov had served the Soviet Union with distinction in various capacities between 1969 and 1985. The obituary did not mention his work in Sweden, his years under cover, or the secrets he had carried. It simply noted his service, his retirement, and his death. And then he disappeared from history, as if he had never existed at all. Alex Sullivan learned of his brother's death in 2004, more than a year after it occurred. He received a brief, formal letter from a Russian government office handling estate matters. The letter informed him that his brother, Viktor Alexandrovich Sokolov, had passed away, and that, as next of kin, he was entitled to claim any remaining personal effects, provided he submitted the proper documentation and paid the associated fees. Alex read the letter twice, standing in his kitchen in Palo Alto, California, with morning coffee cooling in his cup and sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked a garden his wife had planted. He tried to feel something: grief, regret, closure. Anything that would make sense of the decades of silence and the finality of this bureaucratic notification. But all he felt was a profound emptiness, as if something that had been broken long ago had finally stopped pretending it could be fixed. He did not claim his brother's effects. He did not travel to Moscow. He simply filed the letter away and tried to return to his life, to his family, to the world he had built in the decades since leaving Russia. But that night, unable to sleep, he went to his office and searched through old files until he found a photograph he had carried with him from Moscow to New York to Washington to California. It showed two boys standing in front of a wooden dacha, summer sunlight filtering through birch trees behind them. The older boy had his arm around the younger one's shoulders. Both were smiling. Alex studied the photograph for a long time, remembering the summer it was taken, remembering the brother he had lost long before Viktor's death, remembering the promises they had made when the world was young and they believed that loyalty and love were the same thing. Then he put the photograph back in the file, closed the drawer, and went to bed. Because that was what survivors did. They carried their losses quietly. They continued. They learned to live with the ghosts. The Cold War produced millions of casualties. Most of them were never counted in official statistics. They died in interrogation rooms and prison camps, in exile and isolation, in the slow grinding of systems that demanded everything and gave nothing back. They died of compromised ideals and broken promises, of loyalties that turned out to be lies and sacrifices that meant nothing in the end. Viktor and Alexei Sokolov were two of these casualties. They did not die in dramatic fashion. They were not heroes or villains. They were simply two brothers who loved each other once, before the machinery of history got between them and taught them that love was less important than ideology, that family was less valuable than state secrets, that human connection was a luxury neither side could afford. The world has changed since the Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall is gone. The Soviet Union has dissolved. The files are slowly being opened and the secrets are gradually being revealed. But some losses cannot be recovered. Some wounds cannot be healed. Some relationships, once broken by the weight of history, remain broken forever. If you walk through Moscow today, you will not find any memorial to Viktor Sokolov. His name appears in no history books. His service is commemorated in no museum. He is simply gone, erased as thoroughly as he erased himself during 16 years under cover in Stockholm. But somewhere in California, in a file drawer in a house overlooking a garden, there is a photograph of two boys. And if photographs could speak, this one would tell you that before the Cold War divided them, before ideology and espionage and competing empires made them enemies, there were two brothers who believed the world was large enough for both of them. They were wrong. The world was not large enough. It never is, for those caught between empires. And the tragedy is not that they ended up on opposite sides. The tragedy is that they both believed they were serving something larger than themselves, something worth the sacrifice. They believed in systems that promised meaning and delivered only loss. They sacrificed everything for ideals that turned out to be just machinery wearing the mask of purpose. In the end, both brothers died alone, one in Moscow, one in California. They died as they had lived for decades, separated by choices they made and circumstances they could not control, carrying secrets they could never share, and mourning a connection that survived despite everything, even though it could never be spoken aloud. The Cold War is over. The documents are being declassified. The stories are slowly emerging. But some stories remain classified not because they contain secrets of national security, but because they contain secrets of the human heart. And those are the ones that hurt the most, because they remind us that systems and ideologies and competing visions of how the world should be, all of these things demand that we sacrifice not just our lives, but our ability to love the people who matter most. If stories like this make you reflect on the human cost of ideological conflict, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten, not because they reveal intelligence operations or diplomatic failures, but because they reveal what happens to ordinary people when history uses them as pawns. The documents can be declassified. The operations can be analyzed. But the human losses remain, quietly carried by those who survived, and silently mourned by those who understand that the real casualties of the Cold War were not nations or systems, but families torn apart by the machinery of empires that cared nothing for the wreckage they left behind.